The Outer Worlds plays just like a Fallout game. That's a pretty tepid description and an obvious comparison. It's easy to take one look at the game, which strongly echoes the mechanical form of Bethesda RPGs, and think you know what to expect. But the Outer Worlds doesn't just play like a Fallout game. It is, surprisingly, the best possible version of a Fallout game. A potent distillation of what made that series so beloved in the first place.
Hundreds of thousands of colonists left adrift out here forever, just to keep from damaging the board's bottom line. Disgraceful.
The Outer Worlds adopts the most compelling innovations of modern Fallout games, emphasizing immersive exploration and impactful, action-oriented combat in a game engine that actually makes those things feel good by contemporary standards. It shares Fallout's satirical but incredibly bleak look at the future, but is free of its tired tropes. Critically, The Outer Worlds exhibits the same depth of soul as the early Interplay and Black Isle Fallout games, with a genuinely complex, interconnected narrative web of relationships and events that feel like they can change in a seemingly infinite number of ways based on the character you want to be, the variety of choices you can make, and the actions you can take. But that's not the only element that makes The Outer Worlds an excellent space western adventure. It's just the incredibly sound foundation that elevates the game's great world building, wonderful characters, and multi-layered quest design, on top of punchy combat and consistently sharp writing.
Job assessment. It's a mess!
In The Outer Worlds, you are just one of thousands of people left in hibernation on an abandoned colony ship when a scientist of possibly ill repute frees you and enlists your help in saving the rest of your frozen peers. After a rigorous character creation process involving a slew of variable attributes, perks, and aesthetic customization, you crash land on a planet alone, and from there, how you make your mark on the Halcyon system is up to you. The crux of the sci-fi setup is that, among other things, the Halcyon system is owned and run entirely by a board of corporations, and their presence is a big deal. Corporate capitalism so deeply affects everything in the Outer Worlds, and explorations into how it can affect society on a variety of levels is a surprisingly well-considered constant, despite the semblance of parody. You'll meet sympathetic workers whose livelihoods are only made possible by offering themselves to exploitation and indentured servitude, white-collared outlaws who are more bureaucrats than pirates, and well-meaning middle managers who are just trying to change the corporate machine from the inside. You'll find moderates, idealists, extremists, and most things in between and around the fringes, all of whom have their own feasible ideas about how to best serve the colony or themselves. By the time the climax hits, it's clear that the Outer Worlds has its own stance on this bleak future, but that doesn't stop the world it creates, the sojourns you take, and characters you meet along the way from being any less fascinating. Now, there are plenty of characters in the Outer Worlds who I didn't like. Reed Thompson, for example, is a sniveling factory chief in the early hours of the game who I didn't have to think twice about undermining. And Felix, one of your potential companion characters, had such an annoyingly naive personality I avoided talking to him as much as possible. Now, the Outer Worlds allows you to kill any character in the game bar one, and the world will reshape and move on without them. But there's something to be said for the game's depiction of its unappealing people, whose portrayal I admired despite my distaste. I never felt like I had to endure stretches of pointless or overly dramatic exchanges, both because of how focused and subtle the script seemed to be, as well as the variety of response options for my player character, which kept conversations flowing in largely natural ways. Numerous considerations of the world state let conversations take into account things you may or may not have already done throughout your campaign. And solid, consistent voice direction helps keep the tone firmly measured, meaning the hours you spend absorbing the world through its people are always engaging. But nowhere does the strength of the game's characters shine more strongly than in your companions, however.
Crew report. Miyoka is drunk. Surprise.
Human, you are in violation of Cleanliness Ordinance 8886.
You have the option to recruit 6 predetermined characters to accompany and assist you in your adventures who instantly feel like fleshed out characters of their own accord, not simply like they exist to revolve around you. They'll converse privately with each other and chime in on conversations you have with other characters in the world, acting as sounding boards during key moments.
Life is fated and unstoppable.
And you're unshut-upable.
Companions have their own customizable skill trees, equipment loadouts, combat tactics, and special abilities you can command them to use, which, with their cinematic camera angles, inspired battle cries, and useful status effects, never become unsatisfying to initiate. The other major tool at your disposal in combat, provided your character's weapon skills are high enough to use it, is the tactical time dilation, a time-bending mechanic that slows the action to a crawl, allowing you to give yourself some breathing room in order to analyze enemies and take time to execute precision attacks. Now, despite having strong RPG foundations, foundations, the combat in the Outer Worlds is very much focused on first-person action, incorporating things like parries, blocks, and dodges on top of an array of melee weapons and firearms. There's a hectic and fast-paced fluidity to combat that feels very good, however. That's aided by some enthusiastic sound design, which does most of the heavy lifting and giving all weapons some satisfying feedback. A range of science weapons brings some creative diversity into your arsenal, and features guns that have unique, entertaining properties like shrinking enemies or turning them against each other. The only problem with combat is that on the game's recommended regular difficulty, it eventually turns into a cakewalk. This is satisfying in its own way, of course, but it also meant that I didn't feel pushed to explore the game's slew of combat-adjacent mechanics nearly as deeply as I would have hoped. Things like elemental damage and weapon modding and consumables. Jumping into the supernova difficulty level in a subsequent playthrough changes all that, however. Combat danger increases, your ability to save your game is restricted, and survival mechanics like hunger and thirst are introduced, making all of the game's mechanical considerations feel far more vital. The game is more challenging and interesting because of it, but its demanding nature definitely makes it more of a second run option. Of course, toe-to-toe combat is not the only solution to your problems. The Outer Worlds allows for a variety of avenues for alternative and passive solutions. Stealth, hacking, and speech-related options are available throughout the game, provided you pass the skill checks.
Sublight? Ah, I hate it when you outlaws organize. The paperwork for killing you would be the death of me.
It's nigh impossible to complete the game without getting into at least some combat, unfortunately, but to the game's credit, virtually every quest in the game, big or small, features branching options in terms of their paths to success and how you deal with the big final choices you have to make to resolve disputes, which are often deliciously grey. When you hit the end, the game runs through a whole slew of epilogues that describe how you resolve the game's numerous major variables and what became of them. And being shown all your exploits after some 30 hours makes the whole journey and your unique path through it really feel quite meaningful. I finished the Outer Worlds wanting more, eager to jump back into the world to see extra things. It's not a short game, but it's one packed with such a steady stream of wonderful characters to meet, interesting places to explore, and meaningful multi-layered quests to solve that it didn't feel like there was any room to get tired of it. The Outer Worlds is consistently compelling throughout, and it's a superb example of how to promote traditional RPG sensibilities in a sharp, modern experience.
Now playing a Spacer's Choice advertisement jingle.
It's not the best choice. It's Spacer's Choice.
Everyone in Halcyon is contractually obligated to label this or another board-certified jingle their favorite song.